Take the kids and go. She's the life I actually want.
Too late. I filed for divorce, and the house is already sold.
Christmas Eve, a story of Eleanor Hartwell. Chapter 1. The Christmas Eve he never saw coming. The gingerbread was still warm. That was the detail Eleanor kept coming back to, even weeks later, when people asked her how she managed to stay so calm that night. The smell of it, brown sugar and cinnamon and something close to cloves, had worked its way into every corner of the house by the time Dominic's headlights swept across the living room wall at 9:14 on Christmas Eve. She had baked it that morning, the way she did every year, because the children expected it. Because Sophie had been talking about decorating the little men since the 1st of December, sticking her drawings of icing patterns on the refrigerator like blueprints. Because some things, Eleanor had decided a long time ago, you keep doing even when everything else is falling apart. The tree was still lit. She had not turned it off. 43 ornaments on that tree. She knew because she had counted them once, the year Dominic forgot their anniversary, and she had needed something to do with her hands at 2 in the morning. Glass balls in burgundy and gold, a wooden star Sophie painted at school with one point slightly too long, the ceramic angel with a chip on its wing that had survived 17 moves and 3 houses and one very bad year when Eleanor almost left it in storage on purpose. The lights blinked slow and steady, the way the children liked, and the presents underneath were already sorted into 2 piles. Liam's on the left, Sophie's on the right, wrapped in the same paper she bought every December at the shop on Westheimer, because it was the closest one, carried the kind with real metallic thread. Eleanor had done all of that. She had baked the cookies and decorated the tree and wrapped the presents and filled the stockings, and then she had packed 2 small rolling suitcases and set them quietly by the front door. She was standing in the kitchen when he came in, not waiting. She had stopped doing that a long time ago. She was finishing the dishes, the ones from the dinner she had made the children at 6. The pot roast they asked for because it was Christmas, and pot roast was what their grandmother made. Liam had eaten 2 bowls. Sophie had arranged hers into the shape of a Christmas tree on her plate and then eaten it from the outside in. Eleanor had watched them and felt something she could not quite name, a kind of aching clearness, like when you step outside on a very cold morning and the air is sharp enough to taste. She heard the door. She dried her hands. She did not turn around right away. She let him come into the kitchen, heard him set down his keys on the counter with that particular sound, keys on marble, quick and careless, and then she turned. He looked tired. She noticed that first, the way she always did, the way 8 years of marriage trains you to read a person's face before they say a word. His tie was loosened, and his hair was slightly off, like he had run a hand through it too many times in the car, and he had that look he got when he was rehearsing something, eyes a fraction too deliberate, jaw set a degree too straight. He had been rehearsing something. Eleanor reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out the envelope. She had put it there that morning, between the takeout menus and the phone charger that no longer matched any phone in the house, because it was the one drawer in the kitchen Dominic never opened. 8 years, and he had never once looked for anything in that drawer. She knew his habits the way she knew the house, completely, and with a certain detachment that had taken her a long time to arrive at. She held out the envelope. He looked at it, then at her. She said, very quietly, "I already signed the papers this morning, Dominic. Merry Christmas." The silence after that was a specific kind, not the silence of shock, not the silence of anger building up behind a face, something flatter. She watched him try to locate the correct response and not quite find it. and she felt something that was not satisfaction exactly. More like the feeling of setting down a very heavy bag you have been carrying. For so long you forgot what it was like to have both hands free, he said. What papers? She said. Open it. She had turned back to the sink before he finished reading the first page. She heard the paper, the slight sound of it in his hands, and she listened to the refrigerator hum and the faint sound of the neighbor's Christmas music coming through the wall, something orchestral and slow, and she thought about the drive ahead of her. Houston to River Oaks was not far, maybe 12 minutes this time of night. Her sister's house with its wide front porch and the wreath of real eucalyptus Margaret put up every year because she said fake wreaths were depressing. The children were already in bed. She had told them they were going to Aunt Margaret's for a Christmas Eve sleepover, which Sophie accepted with great enthusiasm and which Liam accepted with the careful quiet of a 10-year-old who understood something was happening that he was not being told. He had hugged her twice before he fell asleep. She had stayed on the edge of his bed a few minutes longer than she needed to. Eleanor. Dominic's voice behind her, different now. Quieter. Eleanor, this is, when did you? Patricia Dunn's office, she said. You've met her. She was at the Hartwell benefit 2 years ago, the one in February. You said her firm had too many oil clients. She turned off the faucet. She folded the dish towel over the handle of the oven door. I'd like you to read it tonight, she said. All of it, not just the front page. Patricia says the language in section 4 is particularly clear, but I'd start at the beginning. She walked past him, not fast, not slow. She picked up her coat from the chair in the hallway. She took her keys from her own hook. She had always had a separate hook, and she stopped at the living room door because she wanted to look at the tree one more time. The lights blinked slow and steady. The ceramic angel with the chipped wing sat in her usual spot near the top, slightly crooked from the year. Liam tried to fix her and made it incrementally worse. Eleanor had not cried yet. She did not think she was going to, not tonight. She had cried plenty. She had done it the way she did most difficult things, alone and with some privacy, and having thought it through first. She had cried the afternoon she found the messages, sitting in her car in the parking structure of the Galleria, with the engine running and the radio off, and she had let herself do it for 20 minutes, and then she had gone home and made dinner, and put the children to bed, and called Patricia Dunn. That had been 8 days ago. Those 8 days felt, in retrospect, like some of the most focused days of her life. She thought about them sometimes. Those weeks just before she met Dominic, she had been 31, freshly back in Houston after her years in New York, staying in her childhood bedroom in the house on Memorial Drive, that her father was already starting to talk about selling. Her mother had been gone 4 years by then. Her father, Charles Vance, had been a precise and methodical man who believed in doing things correctly the first time, and his idea of grief had been to work longer hours and keep the house exactly as it was, and, eventually, to put in place a series of financial structures so layered and thoughtful that Eleanor had not even fully understood them until 6 months ago, when she had finally asked his former partner to walk her through everything. She had married Dominic Hartwell when she was 32. He was 38, already established at Hartwell Capital, the firm his own father had built on downstream oil services and grown into something considerably larger over 30 years. He was good-looking in a way that photographed well and charming in a way that read as genuine until you had been around it long enough to see the architecture underneath. Eleanor had taken a long time to see the architecture. 8 years, give or take. What she had seen, eventually, was that Dominic was a man who needed to be the most important person in every room he was in, and that this was not a flaw exactly, but a fundamental condition, the way some people need 8 hours of sleep and others need the window open, except that Dominic's condition required Eleanor to make herself smaller in increments she had mostly not noticed until the accumulation became undeniable. She noticed, for instance, that she no longer talked at dinner parties the way she used to. She noticed that she had stopped mentioning the work she did with the Vance Foundation, the charitable entity her father had established, and which she had quietly grown from a regional grantmaker into something considerably more significant, partly because whenever she mentioned it, Dominic had a way of steering the conversation somewhere else, not obviously, not rudely, just persistently, until it became easier to not bring it up. She noticed that she had stopped calling her college roommate as often because her college roommate lived in Boston and had opinions, and somehow those phone calls always seemed to happen at a moment that was inconvenient for Dominic, until eventually the moments became too rare to count. She noticed, on a Tuesday evening in the third week of November, that her husband was not at the dinner he had told her he was attending because she ran into Marcus Webb at the grocery store, and Marcus mentioned casually that the event had been moved to the following week, and Eleanor had stood there in the produce aisle holding a bag of clementines and felt something go very still inside her. She had not said anything to Marcus. She had bought the clementines and the other things on her list, and she had driven home and made dinner and asked Dominic how the event went, and he had told her in some detail about a conversation with a portfolio manager and a joke someone made about the Texans, and she had listened and nodded and said the right things, and after he was asleep, she had picked up his phone from the nightstand. The messages went back 7 months. Her name was Cassandra Vale. She was 34 years old, which Eleanor noted without particular surprise. It was almost the expected detail, the detail that would make sense to anyone who heard the story later. She worked in private wealth management at a firm with offices in the Galleria Tower, which explained, in retrospect, a number of things Eleanor had filed away without meaning to. She was beautiful in the way of women who think about being beautiful as a strategy, which was also not a surprise. What was a surprise, the thing Eleanor had not anticipated, was the message from 11 months ago, before any of the others, in which Cassandra wrote to Dominic about a meeting she was planning to request with Hartwell Capital's board, and in which she mentioned, briefly and clearly, that she had already done significant research into the firm's fund structures. The message had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they consider themselves entitled to. Eleanor had put the phone down carefully. She had gone to the kitchen. She had sat at the table in the dark for a while. Then she had thought about her father. Charles Vance had been a precise and methodical man. He had also been a man who loved his daughter with the specific intensity of someone who knows they will not always be around to look out for her, and who plans accordingly. Eleanor had called Patricia Dunn the next morning. She thought about all of this standing in the doorway of her living room on Christmas Eve, looking at the tree, at the blink and glow of the lights her daughter loved, at the ceramic angel with the chipped wing. She thought about what Patricia had said when they finished the last meeting. The afternoon of the 22nd, when Eleanor signed everything, and Patricia walked her through the sequence of what would happen next. Eleanor had been quiet for a moment after, looking out Patricia's office window at the downtown Houston skyline, gray and glittering in the December light. Patricia had said, "How are you doing?" Eleanor had thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I feel like myself," she said. I had forgotten what that felt like. She picked up Sophie's coat from the hook by the door. She had hung it there in case Sophie needed it in the night, and she carried it and her own bag toward the stairs. She stopped at the kitchen door. Dominic was standing at the counter, the papers in one hand, the other flat on the marble. He was looking at her, and his face had the quality of someone who has just understood that they have made a miscalculation. She said, "The children are upstairs. They're asleep. I'd appreciate it if you didn't wake them," she said. "Merry Christmas, Dominic." She went upstairs. She carried Sophie very carefully because Sophie was 6 and floppy when she slept, all loose limbs and warm weight. She got her into the car seat without waking her, and then she went back for Liam, who was harder because Liam was 10 and had a 10-year-old's dignity even in sleep. She settled them both in the back of the car and pulled slowly out of the driveway. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the houses had their lights on. They were that kind of neighborhood, the kind where people put in the effort, where someone organized a caroling event and someone else coordinated the light show on the corner house, and the whole street ended up looking like a photograph of itself. Eleanor drove past the Mercer's yard, where the inflatable snow globe was still spinning, and the Pedersons' house with the white lights in perfect rows, and the house at the end of the block that always went a little overboard with the animated reindeer, and she thought, "I have driven past these houses hundreds of times." She would not live on this street anymore. She had already accepted that. She drove toward River Oaks. Her phone was face down in the cup holder. She had turned off the notifications before she went inside, a small thing Patricia had suggested, simply to keep the first hour clear, to not have anything interrupt the particular clarity of that moment. She would check it when the children were settled. She would call Patricia in the morning. There was no rush for any of it. The radio came on when she started the car, the classical station she kept it on for long drives. Something she did not immediately identify, something quiet and not particularly festive, a piano and strings. She left it on. Sophie made a small sound in the back and then settled. Liam was completely still the way he got when he was trying to stay awake so he could figure out what was happening. "You can sleep," Eleanor said quietly. "We're going to Aunt Margaret's." A pause. "I know," Liam said. "She has the guest room made up for you, the one with the bunk beds." Another pause. "Okay," he said. And then, "Mom, yes. Are you okay?" She thought about what to say. She thought about it the way she thought about most things, honestly and with care. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm really okay. I promise." She heard him settle back against the seat. She drove through the quiet Houston streets, the lights of the city diffused and warm in the December dark, and she thought, whatever happens next, I am not pretending anymore. That was enough for tonight. In her bag, tucked beside her wallet and her phone charger and Sophie's little blanket with the fraying edge, was a file folder. Old, the cardboard worn soft at the corners, the tab labeled in her father's handwriting, neat and slightly old-fashioned, the particular cursive of a man who had learned to write before anyone thought about whether cursive would still be useful. She had taken it from the bottom of her father's fireproof filing cabinet the morning after she found the messages. She had not opened it yet. She knew approximately what was in it. She was not ready to feel all of what she would feel when she read it, but she had brought it. She had put it in the bag with the children's things, and it was there now, and she thought about it the way you think about something solid and real when everything else is uncertain. Her father had thought of everything. She had just needed long enough to understand what that meant. Chapter 2, The Woman They Called Harmless. The morning of December 26th was cold by Houston standards. Not cold the way people in Chicago or Minneapolis would call cold. There was no snow, no ice on the roads, the temperature sitting somewhere in the low 40s, with a wind off the Gulf that cut more than it had any right to for a city this far south, but cold enough that Margaret had turned the heat up in the guest room before Eleanor and the children arrived, cold enough that the eucalyptus wreath on the front door had gone stiff overnight and smelled twice as sharp when you walked past it. cold enough that the city felt quieter than usual, the streets in River Oaks empty and pearl gray in the morning light. Eleanor woke before the children. She lay still for a moment in the guest bed. Margaret's spare room, the one her sister kept for people who needed it, which had been, over the years, various cousins and a college friend going through a divorce, and once, memorably, Eleanor's old colleague from the nonprofit work she had done in her 20s, who showed up with 2 suitcases and no explanation. The room was decorated without any particular theme, just accumulated comfort, a quilt from their grandmother, a lamp with a cream shade, a watercolor of the Texas hill country Margaret had bought at an art fair and liked more than she expected to. It was a room that made no demands on you. And Eleanor had been more grateful for that than she knew how to say. She could hear the children breathing in the bunk room down the hall. She could hear Margaret moving in the kitchen, the particular sound of her sister making coffee, the grinder, then the particular way she handled cabinet doors, not quite quiet but not careless either, the sound of someone trying to be considerate without being precious about it. Eleanor put on her robe and went down. Margaret was at the counter, her back to the door, already dressed in the way she was always dressed before anyone else in the house was awake. Clean clothes, hair done, like she had made a decision early in life about what kind of person she was going to be in the morning, and had never revisited it. She was 4 years older than Eleanor and looked it in the specific way of women who have spent a lot of time outdoors, the lines around her eyes deeper than her age, her face more weathered and considerably more trustworthy. She turned when she heard Eleanor come in. She did not say anything right away. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table and sat down across from where Eleanor pulled out the chair, and they sat in the early morning quiet for a while. Then Margaret said, "How are the kids?" "Sophie doesn't know much," Eleanor said. "She thinks we're having an extended Christmas adventure. Liam knows something happened. He's not asking." Margaret nodded. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "And you?" "I slept," Eleanor said, which was true and was, all things considered, more than she had expected. 5.5 hours. I'll take it. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Margaret had a quality Eleanor had always valued in her. She did not rush to fill silence with comfort. She did not offer reassurances before she understood what was needed. She did not perform concern. She just looked and thought, and then said what she actually meant. "You want to tell me what's in that file folder?" Margaret said. "The one you had in your bag last night." Eleanor looked at her sister. "You always put your bag on the hook by the door," Margaret said. "Last night you put it on the bench inside and kept your hand near it the whole time you were getting the kids settled. I noticed." Eleanor almost smiled. "When did you become so observant?" "I've always been observant," Margaret said. "You've always been private. It balances out." Eleanor took a long drink of her coffee. It was good. Margaret had always made good coffee, the way she did most practical things, with a quiet insistence on getting it right. Eleanor thought about the folder. She thought about what was in it and what it meant and how much she wanted to explain and how much she simply wanted to sit here in this warm kitchen with her sister and not be inside the story for a while. She said, "Dad thought of everything." Margaret was quiet. "I always knew he left me the trust," Eleanor said. "I knew the broad shape of it, but I didn't understand. I never really asked anyone to walk me through the specific structure until recently, the way it was built." She paused. "He used a Delaware holding company. His old partner, Robert Fitch. You remember Robert? He came to the memorial. Robert manages the investment side, but the voting rights for certain assets were structured so that they're non-dilutable. They can't be split or transferred without my direct consent. And some of those assets include," she stopped. "Some of them are tied to Hartwell Capital's largest fund in a way Dominic didn't know about. probably in a way my father specifically chose not to mention to him. Margaret was looking at her steadily. He knew, Eleanor said quietly. Dad knew, when I married Dominic, what Dominic was. Not the details, not what would happen, but the type of man. And he set up the trust the way he did because he was the kind of person who would rather solve a problem in advance than try to fix it after the fact. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret said, "He never told you." "He told me," Eleanor said, "in the way he had told me things. He gave me the folder. He said, when I'm gone and you need to understand what I've left you, read the folder and call Robert Fitch." He said it exactly that way. She paused. "I thought he meant financially. I thought he meant understand what you've inherited. I didn't understand he meant use it, that it was something with a use." Margaret set her cup down. She reached across the table and put her hand over Eleanor's and squeezed once, firmly, the way Margaret expressed things she did not have different words for. "Robert Fitch called it a blocking vote," Eleanor said. "That's the technical term. There are situations in which, without my consent, certain decisions at Hartwell Capital can't go through. Dominic has been restructuring the largest fund. He's been planning to restructure it for about 8 months. She looked at her sister. The same 8 months. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He didn't know." "He didn't know," Eleanor said, "and he didn't know because he never asked, because it never occurred to him that anything in my family's estate was worth paying close attention to." Because she stopped. She was not angry, not exactly. She had moved through anger already, that first night in the parking structure of the Galleria, and what was left was something cleaner. Because he thought I was the kind of woman who doesn't pay attention to that kind of thing. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Well," she said finally, "he's in for a surprise." Eleanor did pick up her phone after that, eventually. She had left it off through the night, the first uninterrupted sleep she'd had in weeks, and when she turned it on, it came alive with messages in the slow, escalating way of a phone that has been ignored for 12 hours. 3 from Patricia Dunn's office. 1 from the family attorney she had technically kept on retainer for 9 years without needing him for anything substantial. 2 from numbers she did not immediately recognize that turned out, when she checked, to be related to Patricia's firm. And then, starting around 11 the previous night and continuing into the morning, a series of messages from Dominic. She read them in order. The first was confused. The second was controlled anger. The third was something trying to be reasonable. The fourth was, briefly, an attempt at something resembling an apology, which she recognized immediately for what it was, not a genuine apology but a tactical one, the kind you offer when you are not sure of your position and you want to buy time. The fifth was asking whether she had spoken to anyone about the trust. The sixth was asking her to call him. The seventh was asking her to call him. The eighth was from this morning and was the shortest of all. It said only, "We should talk before you make any decisions." Eleanor put the phone face down on the table. She called Patricia from the front porch, bundled into Margaret's extra coat, watching a cardinal work its way through the bare branches of the magnolia in the front yard. Patricia answered on the second ring because Patricia was the kind of person who answered on the second ring on December 26th. "Good morning," Patricia said. "How are you?" "Rested," Eleanor said. "He messaged 8 times. I know, his attorney messaged my office 3 times last night and once this morning. I wanted to let you sleep." A brief pause. "He hasn't retained anyone yet, as far as we can tell. He's using the firm's general counsel, which means he doesn't understand yet what kind of proceeding this is." "Good," Eleanor said. "We sent the formal notification this morning," Patricia said. "Standard language, Delaware structure under review. Their counsel will read it and probably flag it as routine disclosure, which is what it's designed to look like at first pass. They'll miss the relevance until someone who knows fund structures looks at it carefully. How long does that take? With their current team? 10 days to 2 weeks. If they move quickly, they'll bring in outside counsel eventually. When they do, we'll know. Patricia paused. Eleanor, I want to say something. Go ahead. You did this very well. 8 days from discovery to execution, with documentation this complex, while managing your children and your household and an active charitable fund, that's not a small thing. I've worked with clients for whom this kind of process takes 3 months, and they still come in unprepared. Eleanor looked at the cardinal in the magnolia. I had a good teacher, she said. He just didn't know he was teaching me. She spent that day the way she wanted to spend it, which was with her children and her sister, and as little complexity as possible. They made pancakes, and then they made a mess with the leftover wrapping paper from the gifts Eleanor had brought, Sophie turning it into a series of surprisingly coherent hats, Liam reading the book he'd gotten from Eleanor's own pile under the tree and pretending not to be delighted by it. Margaret's husband James came back from his brother's house in the early afternoon and was warm and easy about the whole situation in the way of a man who had been married to Margaret for 22 years and had learned from the best. Nobody mentioned Dominic. Nobody asked Eleanor to explain herself. The day had the particular loose quality of a day when all the obligations have been either met or deliberately set aside, and Eleanor moved through it feeling something she identified with some surprise as peace. She did not expect, around 6 that evening, to have a reason to think about Cassandra Vale. She was in the kitchen with Margaret, the children in the den watching a movie, James in the living room with his own book, and the evening was quiet and warm and smelled of the leftover pot. Roast Margaret had reheated for dinner when Eleanor's phone lit up with a number she did not recognize. She almost didn't answer. She had been careful that day about which calls she took, but she looked at the number and something in it was familiar, the area code, the first 3 digits, and she answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, careful and deliberate, with that particular flatness of someone who has prepared what they are going to say. Eleanor, the voice said. It's Cassandra Vale. Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. She walked to the far end of the kitchen, near the door to the back porch, and she leaned against the counter. Margaret glanced at her once, and Eleanor gave the smallest possible shake of her head. I'm listening, Eleanor said. I think we should talk, Cassandra said. Not through attorneys. Directly. I think there are things that are being handled in a way that doesn't have to be, Cassandra, Eleanor said. Before you go further, I want you to understand something. I'm standing in my sister's kitchen. She's 3 feet from me. I have you on speaker. A very brief pause. That's fine, Cassandra said, in a way that made clear it was not entirely fine. I'm just saying there's a way to approach this that's better for everyone involved, including the children. Eleanor felt Margaret go still across the kitchen. I appreciate your concern for the children, Eleanor said. What is it you want to say? There was a quality to Cassandra's voice. Eleanor noticed it now, underneath the control, that was tightly wound, slightly faster than it was trying to be. She had heard from Dominic, possibly in the last few hours, possibly after Dominic had finally gotten someone at his firm to look at the preliminary notification from Patricia's office with real attention. The fund restructuring, Cassandra said. I want you to know that I advised Dominic to be transparent with you about the business decisions. What happened between us personally that's separate. That doesn't have to be connected to the business. Eleanor thought, she is trying to draw a line around what I'm allowed to be angry about. She is trying to tell me which parts of this I'm permitted to make a problem and which parts I'm supposed to leave alone. She said, when you messaged Dominic 11 months ago about the fund restructuring, did you already know about the Delaware holding structure in my trust? Another pause, longer this time. That's a complicated question, Cassandra said. It's a yes or no question, Eleanor said. I've read the message. The one from November of last year. You mentioned doing research into Hartwell Capital's fund structures. I'm asking what that research covered. Margaret had stopped pretending to do anything else in the kitchen. She was standing with her back against the counter, arms folded, watching Eleanor. Cassandra said, "There are a lot of trust structures connected to Hartwell Capital. My firm does a standard review when we're considering any significant." Cassandra, Eleanor said. "Yes, you knew. Or your firm knew, which is the same thing." Eleanor paused. "That changes the nature of the advice you were giving him. It changes what kind of proceeding this is." The line was quiet for a few seconds. Then Cassandra's voice shifted. Not much, she was too controlled for a dramatic shift, but enough. The calculation in it became more visible. "Eleanor, I think you're smart enough to know that going this route costs everyone something. It costs time. It costs money. It costs your children's stability for however long this takes." "That's true," Eleanor said. "So think about what you actually want here, what outcome you want." Eleanor thought about her father's handwriting on the tab of that file folder, neat and slightly old-fashioned. She thought about him sitting at his desk. She could picture it clearly. The leather chair, the window overlooking the garden he tended himself, because he said the garden kept him honest, and she thought about him building all of this, layer by layer, with that particular patience of his, the patience of a man who understood that some protections only work if they are never discussed. She thought about what she wanted. She said, "I want what's mine. That's all I've ever wanted." Cassandra, she ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret said, after a moment, 3 feet. "I was 3 feet away, and I still can barely believe that just happened." Eleanor set her phone on the counter. She felt steady. She felt not triumphant, nothing so simple as that. She felt the way she sometimes felt after a very long and complicated piece of work was finished, the particular clarity of something that has been done correctly. "She's going to tell Dominic I know more than he thought," Eleanor said. "That might make things move faster." "Is that good?" "It depends on how he responds." Eleanor picked up the wooden spoon she had set down before the call and went back to the stove. "Patricia says the best outcome is a negotiated settlement before it gets to the full board review. The second best outcome is the full board review. The worst outcome is," she paused, "but the worst outcome requires Dominic to make several very specific decisions, and I don't think he's capable of making all of them." "What decisions?" Eleanor thought about how to say it. "The decisions of a man who is willing to lose more than he can afford to lose in order to hurt someone," she said. "I don't think Dominic is that man. He's many things. But that particular thing, I don't think so." Margaret looked at her. "You know him that well," she said. It was not quite a question. 8 years, Eleanor said. "You know someone, even when you wish you didn't." She stirred the pot roast. She thought about the fact that somewhere on the other side of Houston, Dominic Hartwell was sitting with the papers she had given him and the phone call he was about to get from Cassandra, and he was beginning to understand that he had spent 8 years in a house with someone he thought he knew, and he had not been paying the right kind of attention. She thought about how long she had not been paying attention either. And then she thought about the morning she had, finally, looked properly. She thought about the cardinal in the magnolia, the way it sat there in the bare branches, absolutely still, absolutely certain of its color in a world that had gone brown and gray for winter. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her stocking feet. "Mom, the movie is at the sad part," she announced. "Liam said to tell you." "Is he crying?" Sophie thought about this with great seriousness. Almost, she said. But he's pretending not to. I'll be there in 5 minutes, Eleanor said. Sophie disappeared. Eleanor heard her padding back down the hallway, heard the particular sound of Liam's voice, low and indignant, telling his sister something she had no business reporting. Margaret said softly, "He built this for you, your father. He built all of it so you'd have somewhere to stand." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He built it so I'd have options," she said. "What I do with it is still mine." She meant that. She thought about it clearly, the way she tried to think about most things that mattered. She was not going to pretend that the trust made everything simple, or that the structure her father had built made her powerful in some uncomplicated way. Power was never uncomplicated. She had watched her father wield it carefully for her entire childhood, and she had absorbed from him, without quite knowing she was absorbing it, the understanding that the only kind worth having was the kind you used in a way you could live with afterward. She did not know yet exactly what all of this would cost her. She knew it would cost something. She turned off the stove and covered the pot and went to find her children. She spent the last 2 hours of that evening sitting between them on Margaret's oversized sofa, Sophie already asleep against her side before the movie ended, Liam staying carefully awake until he couldn't anymore, his head gradually drifting toward her shoulder in the way he was at the age where he was not quite sure he was still allowed to need that. And she had not yet found the right way to tell him that he always would be. The television sent its blue light across the room. The Christmas tree, Margaret kept in the corner of the den, blinked its slow lights. Eleanor sat with her children in the warm room and let the evening settle around her. She thought, briefly, about the file folder, about Robert Fitch's explanations, about Patricia's careful documentation, about the call she had just taken and the calls that would come tomorrow. And then she thought about none of it. She thought about the weight of Sophie against her side and the warmth coming through the old quilt and the smell of the eucalyptus wreath drifting in from the front hall. She thought, this is still mine too, this part, this specifically, and that was enough. In uptown Houston, at an apartment on the 14th floor of a building on Post Oak Lane, Cassandra Vale ended her call with Eleanor and stood for a moment in the November dark of her kitchen. She had very little furniture and a lot of windows. Eleanor would later hear the kind of apartment that expressed a particular idea of itself, and then she called Dominic. He picked up on the first ring. She told him, carefully, and with the same controlled voice she used for everything, what Eleanor had said, what she had implied, what it suggested about how much Eleanor understood about the trust structure. There was a long silence on Dominic's end. Then he said, "She couldn't. She doesn't know anything about the fund." Cassandra said, "She asked me directly about the November message, the one about the research." Another silence. Then, "How did she know about that message?" Cassandra said, "She read your phone." The silence after that was a different kind, the kind that happens when a man realizes, for the first time, that the thing he has been managing has been, for some time, managing him. He said, "I need to get in front of this." She said, "Yes, you do." He said, "I'll call the firm's general counsel. I'll have them look at the trust structure tonight." She said, "Tonight is a holiday." He said, "Then first thing tomorrow." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that, Dominic would think about later, was a very specific thing for her to say. She said, "Be careful with how you handle her. She's not who you thought she was." He heard something in her voice that he had not heard before, something that was not quite certainty, something that might have been, if you listened for it carefully, the first small sound of someone who has realized they have underestimated the wrong person. He said, "I know my wife." She did not say anything to that. She said good night and she ended the call, and she stood in her apartment with the city lights laid out below her, and she thought about November, about the research she had done, about the layers of the trust she had found, and then chosen to interpret a certain way, to interpret as complicated but manageable, because it had been easier to believe that than to properly account for the woman whose name was on it. She had underestimated Eleanor Vance Hartwell. She understood that now. She poured a glass of water and stood at her window for a while. Outside, Houston glittered cold and clear. 20 floors below, the streets were quiet in the way of cities on the day after Christmas, emptied out, the urgency gone out of things, the particular stillness of a moment between what has just ended and what has not yet begun. Cassandra stood at her window and thought about what came next, and for the first time in 8 months, she was not entirely sure she knew. Chapter 3. The document he never expected her to read. The week between Christmas and New Year's has a quality unlike any other week in the calendar year. Everything is technically open: offices, restaurants, the dry cleaner on Westheimer that Eleanor had used for 6 years, but nothing is quite operating at full capacity. People are in the city but not fully present in it, still wearing some residue of the holiday, still moving at a slightly reduced speed, still checking phones with one eye and thinking about something else with the other. The streets in River Oaks were quieter than usual. The Hartwell Capital offices downtown, Eleanor knew, were running on a skeleton staff. Most of the partners had taken the full week. Dominic had not taken the week. Patricia's office confirmed this on the morning of December 27th, when her associate called Eleanor to update her on the preliminary response from Hartwell Capital's general counsel. The language was exactly what Patricia had predicted: routine acknowledgement, standard review language, the particular bureaucratic tone of a legal team that has received something they have categorized as boilerplate and have not yet looked at carefully enough to recategorize. But Dominic himself had been in the office on the 26th and again on the 27th, which was a Saturday. Eleanor thought about this while she sat at Margaret's kitchen table with the file folder open in front of her for the first time. She had waited until the children were out with James. He had taken them to the park, then apparently to a sporting goods store, because Liam had developed an urgent need for a new basketball, which was the kind of thing James handled with the low-key enthusiasm of a man who genuinely liked sporting goods stores and genuinely liked Liam, and Margaret was at the far end of the table with her own coffee and no particular agenda, which was the way Eleanor had needed her. The folder was not thick. Her father had been economical in his documentation, a quality Eleanor had inherited and spent years watching Dominic misread as passivity. What was inside was a series of documents: the original trust agreement, 12 pages on legal paper with the heading Vance Family Trust, dated 17 years ago, 2 years before Eleanor's mother died, a 1-page summary in her father's handwriting that she suspected he had written for her specifically, the handwriting slightly different from his usual careful cursive, slightly larger, like he was thinking about who would be reading it. 3 pages from Robert Fitch's firm outlining the Delaware holding structure and its relationship to certain Hartwell Capital Fund agreements, and at the back, a single sealed envelope with Eleanor's name on it in the same handwriting. She had looked at that envelope for a while before she opened it. Her father had died 4 years ago. A stroke in March, on a Tuesday morning, at his desk, at the office he had kept even in retirement because he said the garden kept him honest and the office kept him useful. He had been 71 years old and in reasonable health, and it had happened without warning the way those things sometimes do. And Eleanor had gotten the call at 11 in the morning and had driven to the hospital and had arrived 11 minutes too late. She had not cried about her father in front of Dominic. She had not known why at the time. She had told herself it was privacy, that she processed grief differently, all the things you tell yourself when you do not want to examine the real reason. The real reason, she understood now, was that she had not trusted him with it, that grief was too real and too private to expose to someone who would manage it, who would say the right things in the right order, who would be kind in the way of someone performing kindness, rather than feeling it. She had cried about her father in her car, in her kitchen after midnight, once in a Whole Foods parking lot on a Tuesday in April when she heard a song he used to play. On Sunday mornings, she opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on his office stationery, the heavy cream paper with the small VF monogram in navy at the top, the kind he had ordered from a printer in New York every year for as long as Eleanor could remember. The date on it was 8 years ago, 2 months after her wedding. She read it once, quickly, then again slowly. He wrote the way he talked, directly, with very little decoration. He told her that he loved her, which he had always been able to say, in writing in a way that cost him something to say out loud, and that he was proud of her, and that he hoped she was happy. He wrote about her mother. He wrote, briefly and carefully, about Dominic, not unkindly, with the specific fairness of a man who is trying to be honest rather than right, and said that he thought Dominic was not a bad man, but was a man who needed to be watched, and that Eleanor was capable of watching, and that he trusted her judgment. He wrote about the trust. He said, "I have built this in a particular way that I will not explain fully in this letter, because some things are better understood when they become relevant rather than in advance. What I will tell you is that your mother and I wanted you to always have a place to stand. Whatever happens, there is a place for you to stand. Robert knows the rest." He said, "I hope you never need any of it. I hope you and Dominic grow old together, and the trust is only ever a thing that funds the foundation and takes care of the grandchildren I am hoping for. But if you ever do need it, do not be afraid of it. It is yours. It was always yours. I built it with your hands in mind." The last line was, "You are braver than you know. Eleanor, you always have been." She sat with the letter for a while. Margaret did not say anything. She refilled Eleanor's coffee at some point without being asked and went back to her own end of the table, and Eleanor was aware of her sister's presence the way you are aware of something steady and dependable, a fixed point in a room that is not, otherwise, particularly fixed. After a while, Eleanor folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on top of the folder. She said, "He knew." Margaret said, "Yes, he didn't tell me directly because he thought it would change how I looked at the marriage." "Probably," Margaret said. "He wanted you to have the marriage. He just wanted you to have the exit, too." Eleanor looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. Margaret's garden in winter was mostly dormant, the beds mulched, the roses cut back, the big live oak standing bare and patient the way live oaks in Houston do, holding their shape through the cold months, because they know spring is coming and they are in no particular hurry. "I need to go to the house," Eleanor said. "The house on Maple Brook." "Yes," she paused, "not to stay. I need to get some things, documents, some of Sophie's specific toys she'll ask for, and I need to, I don't know, I need to see it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Alone?" she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I think so." She drove over that afternoon while the children were still out with James. The neighborhood was as quiet as it had been on Christmas Eve, which was 2 nights ago, and felt, simultaneously, like 2 weeks ago and like this morning. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a minute. The house looked the same as it always did from the outside. The brick, the white trim, the hydrangeas along the front walk that she had planted herself the year after they moved in because the builder's landscaping had been generic in a way that bothered her. The hydrangeas were bare and blunt in December, just sticks. but they would come back in April. They always did. She went in. The tree was still lit. She had not turned it off before she left, and apparently Dominic had not turned it off either, and it blinked there in the living room, slightly more forlorn in daylight, the presents still in their two piles on the floor. She turned it off. She stood in the room for a moment, listening to the house settle around her, and then she went upstairs and gathered what she needed. Sophie's specific stuffed rabbit, the one named Gerald that had been lost and found so many times it had its own personal mythology, Liam's drawing pad and the set of charcoals he had been working with, her own laptop, and the small external drive she kept her professional files on, the photograph from the bedroom dresser, the one of herself and Margaret and their father at Eleanor's college graduation, her mother's absence acknowledged in the particular way of family photographs taken in grief, everyone leaning slightly toward each other. She went into the study. Dominic's study was a room she had been in thousands of times and had never found entirely comfortable, not because of anything specifically wrong with it, but because it was thoroughly his books in his particular order, his photographs, the particular smell of the leather chair, and the specific wood of the desk. She was not there for anything of his. She went to the small locked cabinet along the back wall, the one she had the key to, the one he had perhaps forgotten she had the key to, and she took out the two documents inside and added them to her bag. She was almost at the front door when she heard a car in the driveway. She stood still. The door opened. Dominic looked at her. He was in the clothes he had worn to the office, gray trousers, a blue shirt, no tie, the kind of Saturday clothes of a man who goes to the office on Saturday, because going to the office on Saturday is how he understands himself. He looked like he had not slept much. He looked, for possibly the first time in Eleanor's experience of him, like a man who was genuinely uncertain what to say. He said, "I didn't know you were here." "I came to get a few things," Eleanor said. "I'm just leaving." He looked at her bag. He did not ask what was in it. He said, Can we talk for a few minutes?" Eleanor thought about it. She thought about Patricia's instructions, which were generally sensible about direct one-on-one conversations without counsel, present this early in proceedings. She thought about whether there was anything she actually needed to say to Dominic Hartwell at this particular moment. She said, "A few minutes." They sat at the kitchen table, not the good dining table, the kitchen table, the one the children did homework at, the one with the slight wobble on the right side that Dominic had said he would fix for 3 years and had not fixed. Someone had left a school permission slip on it from before the holidays. Eleanor recognized Liam's handwriting on the top corner, his name written in the slightly effortful cursive of a 10-year-old practicing. Dominic sat with his hands flat on the table. He had, she noted, read the documents. She could see it in him, not anything she could have pointed to specifically, just a quality in his stillness, in the particular way he was holding the knowledge that what he thought was a contained situation was, in fact, nothing of the sort. He said, "I brought in an outside attorney yesterday, someone who specializes in trust litigation." Eleanor said, "That was smart. He spent 4 hours with the prenuptial agreement and the trust documentation that Patricia's office disclosed." He paused. "He asked me whether I knew about the Delaware holding company before I filed the restructuring plan for the fund." Eleanor waited. "I didn't," Dominic said. "I want you to know that. I didn't know the structure existed. I didn't know it had any relationship to Hartwell Capital's assets." "I know," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "I know you didn't know," she said. "That's not in question." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, did you know when you married me?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "No," she said. "I knew I had a trust. I knew it was significant. I didn't understand the specific structure until recently." She paused. "My father understood it. He built it that way on purpose." Dominic looked at the permission slip on the table. His jaw moved slightly. Your father never liked me. That's not true, Eleanor said. My father was perfectly civil to you. That's not the same thing. No, Eleanor agreed. It's not. A silence settled between them. Not comfortable, but not the performance of discomfort either. Just the particular silence of two people who have been in the same rooms for 8 years and are now sitting on opposite sides of a table with a wobble on the right side. Dominic said, my attorney thinks we can challenge the standing of the blocking vote on procedural grounds. It would take time, but he thinks there's a viable argument. Your attorney is probably right that there's a procedural argument, Eleanor said. Whether it's viable is a different question. Patricia has been building this structure or maintaining it for 4 years since my father died. If there were procedural vulnerabilities, they've been addressed. He looked at her differently for a moment. She saw it, the slight adjustment, the recalibration. He was seeing something he had not seen before, or had seen and not registered. She thought, this is what Cassandra meant when she told you I was not who you thought I was, and she was right, except that she had the framing wrong. I am exactly who I have always been. You simply weren't paying attention. She did not say any of that. She said, Dominic, I want to ask you something. I want you to answer it honestly, not strategically. He waited. She said, was Cassandra advising you fund the fund restructuring because she wanted to help your business, or because the restructuring served something her firm needed? He did not answer immediately. She watched him think about it, watched him go through the particular process of a man deciding how much of what he knows he is going to admit to knowing. Then he said quietly, both. She nodded. She has clients, he said. Funds she manages. The restructuring would have. He stopped. He ran a hand over his face. I knew there was overlap. I told myself it was standard practice. It may well be, Eleanor said. That's a question for your attorney and the SEC, not for me. He looked at her sharply. I'm not threatening anything, she said. I'm telling you where the boundaries of my concern are. My concern is the trust, the divorce settlement, and the children. That's all. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, do you remember the Christmas 7 years ago when I got stuck in Boston? She looked at him. The storm, he said. The one in December. I was at a conference and the airport shut down and I couldn't get back. You called at 6 in the afternoon and the kids were, Sophie was so small. She didn't understand why I wasn't there. He paused. You called and you told me it was fine. Everything was fine. You'd handled it. And I could hear in your voice that you had handled it and that it was fine. And I told myself that was just how you were, that you were capable and you didn't need. He stopped. I used that. I used the fact that you were capable as a reason not to try harder. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She thought about that Christmas. She remembered it clearly. Sophie was just under 2, Liam was 3. She had made their dinner and decorated the gingerbread and put them to bed, and then sat alone in the kitchen for an hour, feeling something she had labeled at the time as just ordinary sadness, the ordinary sadness of a holiday that hadn't gone the way she hoped. She had not let herself label it as something more significant. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, I know you used it, and I let you use it. For a long time, I convinced myself that being capable was enough, that managing things was the same as them being okay. She paused. It wasn't. He did not say anything. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She said, I'm not interested in punishing you, Dominic. I want you to understand that. What Patricia is doing is not punishment. It's just what's mine. Return to me. He stayed sitting at the table. He was looking at the permission slip with Liam's name on it. She watched him for a moment, watched the particular way he sat in that kitchen that had been his kitchen for 6 years. surrounded by the specific evidence of the life they had built together, the life he had not been sufficiently present in to fully understand he was losing it until it was in the process of being lost. She said, "He asked me this morning if I was okay, Liam." Dominic looked up. "I told him I was," she said. "I was telling the truth. I'd like you to think about what you're going to tell him when he asks you the same question." She went to the door. She drove away from the house on Maple Brook for the second time in 3 days, and this time she did not need to sit in the car first. She pulled out of the driveway and drove toward River Oaks, and she thought about what she had felt, sitting across from Dominic at the kitchen table, with the permission slip and the wobble on the right side and everything between them laid as flat as she had ever seen it. She had not felt anger. She had felt something more complicated, a kind of sorrow that was not grief exactly, more like the feeling of understanding something fully for the first time and wishing, in a small part of yourself, that you had understood it differently earlier so that what you understand now might have been fixable then. She had not said any of that to him. Some things you understand privately. She called Patricia from the car. "How was it?" Patricia said. "Unexpectedly human," Eleanor said. A pause. "Is that good or bad?" "It's useful," Eleanor said. "He's scared, not of the legal proceedings, or not only of those. He's scared of what he's understanding about himself." She paused. "I think he'll negotiate rather than litigate. I think, if you push toward a board meeting, he'll find a way to settle before it gets there." "What makes you think that?" Eleanor thought about the way he had looked at the permission slip with Liam's name on it. "Because he's not entirely without conscience," she said. "He just misplaced it for a while." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll move forward with the board notification. We'll give them until the 3rd of January. "That's right," Eleanor said. She merged onto the highway. Traffic was light, the particular lightness of Houston between the holidays, the city in a brief suspension of itself, everyone slightly outside their usual speed. She thought about the letter in the file folder. "You are braver than you know, Eleanor." She thought about her father at his desk, on a Tuesday in March, doing whatever he had been doing in the last minutes of his life. Working, probably. Something careful and precise. She hoped it had been something he liked. She thought about the board meeting that was coming and what it would feel like to walk into that room. She thought about a day in November when she had stood in a grocery store parking lot with a bag of clementines and gone very still, and how that stillness had been the beginning of something she was only now beginning to be able to name. She thought, he was right. I am brave enough. She drove. The Texas sky above the highway was that particular December blue, deep and clear and cold-looking, the kind of blue that has nothing to prove, that is simply itself without apology. The sun sat low and bright and threw long shadows across the road. She thought about the board meeting on the 3rd of January. She thought about what she was going to say. She had been composing it for 2 weeks, the way she composed everything important, in pieces, in odd moments, building it slowly and then letting it sit until it was ready. She thought about the single sentence she planned to say before Patricia explained anything. The one sentence that would be enough on its own for anyone in that room who had ever felt like the least important person at the table they were sitting at. She thought about her father building the trust 17 years ago with her hands in mind. She drove toward River Oaks. She drove toward her children and her sister's house with the eucalyptus wreath and the old guest room quilt and the particular warmth of a place where she was allowed to simply be Eleanor, not a wife or a figure in a legal proceeding or an estranged partner in a dissolving marriage, just Eleanor, who baked gingerbread and counted ornaments and drove through the city at night, thinking about what came next. She was almost there when her phone rang. Robert Fitch, her father's old partner, calling from what she knew would be his study in the house in Memorial. He had never moved out of the neighborhood, had stayed in the same house for 30 years, a fact her father had found both endearing and slightly provincial, which was one of those areas where they had disagreed with complete warmth. She answered on the car speaker. "Eleanor," he said. He had a deep, slow voice, the voice of someone who had decided decades ago that there was no situation that required him to speak faster than he felt like speaking. "I heard from Patricia this morning. I understand things are moving." "They are," she said. "Your father would have thought this was interesting," Robert said. She almost smiled. "He would have wanted to manage it himself." "Absolutely," Robert said. "He would have been entirely insufferable about it." A pause. "He also would have been very pleased with you. I want you to know that. The way you've handled this, the 8 days, the documentation, the sequencing, he would have been pleased." She did not say anything for a moment. She said, "Thank you, Robert. Call me after the board meeting," he said. "I'll be available." "Whatever you need," she said she would. She pulled into Margaret's driveway. She could hear the children through the window. Liam's voice, higher than usual the way it got when he was playing something, and Sophie's laugh, which was exactly the same laugh she had been doing since she was 2 years old, wide open and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has not yet learned that laughing too easily is supposed to be embarrassing. Eleanor sat in the car for a moment. She looked at the eucalyptus wreath on the door. She picked up the file folder from the passenger seat and held it for a moment, the worn cardboard corners, the tab in her father's handwriting, and she thought, "He put it in my hands. He put all of it in my hands." She got out of the car. She went inside. Chapter 4, The Seat at His Table. The 3rd of January was a Monday. Houston in early January has a particular quality that Eleanor had always found difficult to describe to people who had not lived there. It is not quite winter, not in any way that the word winter implies to someone from the Northeast or the Midwest, but it is not warm either. It sits in a gray middle distance, the sky low and pewter-colored, the air damp in a way that gets into your coat regardless of how good your coat is, the city stripped of its holiday decorations, and not yet in possession of any other reason to look festive. The streets downtown have that post-Christmas blankness, the particular flatness of a city returning to its ordinary self after a month of pretending to be something slightly more luminous. Eleanor had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, or not primarily from anxiety. She had slept a reasonable number of hours, had woken to the sound of James making coffee downstairs, and lain in the dark for a while with her eyes open, thinking through the morning the way she always thought, through important things, sequentially and without dramatics. She had done everything that could be done. Patricia's preparation was meticulous. The documentation was complete. The sequence of events in that boardroom was going to unfold the way it was going to unfold, and her job this morning was simply to be present for it with a minimum of performance. She had gotten up at 5:30 and dressed carefully. She had learned early from watching her father and later from her own experience running the Vance Foundation's board presentations that how you dress for a room matters less than people who don't think about it imagine, but more than people who overthink it want to admit. She wore the charcoal suit she had bought for a foundation gala 2 years ago, the one with the slim lapel and the particular cut that suggested authority without announcing it. She wore her mother's pearl earrings, which she never wore to anything she was not serious about. She wore no other jewelry. She ate breakfast with the children at 7. Sophie was in the middle of a complicated argument with her stuffed rabbit Gerald about whether Gerald was allowed to sit at the table, a debate Eleanor had been refereeing for 2 years and which had never reached a satisfying conclusion for anyone involved. Liam was reading at the table, in the way she had never been able to stop him from doing, the book propped against the cereal box with the focused absence of a person who is technically present but operationally somewhere else entirely. She watched them and thought, whatever happens in the next 4 hours, this part is not in question. She had established that already. Margaret's house for the immediate term, then the apartment she had identified in River Oaks, 2 bedrooms, close enough to the children's school that the route didn't change, with a 3rd room she planned to use as an office for the foundation work. She had signed the lease on the 29th. She had told the children's school in a brief and unemotional email to the principal that there would be a family transition in the new year and that she would be the primary contact for the time being. She had updated her foundation board on the bare minimum of what was relevant to them. She had arranged, through Patricia's office, for a temporary order governing the children's schedule until the formal custody arrangement was finalized. She had done all of this in the 8 days between Christmas and this morning with the particular efficiency of someone who understands that the best way to get through a hard time is to stay busy with something useful. Margaret drove her downtown. They did not talk much in the car. Margaret had turned on the radio, the classical station, which Eleanor had not asked for but recognized immediately as an act of love, and they drove through the quiet Monday morning streets with the music and the gray sky and the smell of coffee from the travel mug Margaret had put in the cup holder for her. They passed the neighborhood where Eleanor and Dominic had lived, which was only slightly out of the way, and which Eleanor suspected Margaret had deliberately included in the route, for reasons Eleanor did not examine too closely. She looked at the street as they passed. The hydrangeas were bare. The neighbor's inflatable snow globe had been packed away. She looked, and then she looked forward. The Hartwell Capital offices were on the 23rd floor of a building on Louisiana Street, the kind of building that had been built in the early 80s, with a particular conviction about what financial gravitas looked like, and had held on to that conviction through 3 decades of changing architectural fashion. The lobby was marble and low light. The elevators were polished brass. The whole effect was of a place that took itself very seriously and wanted you to take it seriously too. Eleanor had been in this building hundreds of times. She had come to Dominic's holiday parties here, had sat in the conference room adjacent to his office for various foundation-related meetings, had once spent 2 hours in the lobby waiting for him during an afternoon that had been, in retrospect, one of the early signs of something she had not wanted to see yet. She knew the security guard's name, Raymond. He had been here for at least 6 years, always wore a pin on his jacket that changed seasonally, currently a small silver snowflake left over from December. Raymond recognized her. She saw him start to say something, and she smiled and kept moving, because she was not interested in small talk this morning. And Raymond, who was observant, clocked this and nodded and let her go. Patricia was waiting in the lobby. Patricia Dunn was 61 years old, small and precise, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular manner of a woman who had spent 4 decades in rooms where people underestimated her and had long since decided to find this useful rather than frustrating. She wore a dark navy suit and carried a leather briefcase that Eleanor knew contained approximately 400 pages of documentation, arranged in a specific order that Patricia could navigate in the dark. She looked at Eleanor and said, simply, "You look good." Eleanor said, "So do you." They did not need more than that. 2 associates from Patricia's firm were in the elevator with them, young women, early 30s, both carrying their own versions of the organized briefcase, both with the particular focused calm of people who have prepared thoroughly and are now in the mode of executing what they prepared. Eleanor had met them before. She appreciated their quiet. She appreciated, in general, Patricia's tendency to staff around herself with people who understood that preparation was the performance and the meeting itself was just the proof. 23rd floor. The reception area of Hartwell Capital was a room Eleanor knew well enough to have strong opinions about. The particular shade of the walls, a deep taupe that Dominic had chosen, and that Eleanor had always thought was trying slightly too hard to look understated. The company name in brushed steel letters on the wall behind the reception desk. The framed photographs of various buildings and pipeline installations and handshakes that were the visual vocabulary of a firm whose business was, at its heart, the movement of energy from the ground to somewhere else. The receptionist looked up. Eleanor said, "Eleanor Hartwell, for the board meeting." The receptionist had the look of someone who had been given specific and slightly unusual instructions about this morning's 9 o'clock and was executing those instructions with professional composure. Well, of course, Mrs. Hartwell. They're in the main conference room. The main conference room had a view. This was the thing Eleanor noticed every time she came to this floor. The room itself was unremarkable. The long table and the leather chairs and the presentation screen and the water pitchers, all the furniture of decisions made in rooms like this, across the city and the country and the world. But the window ran the full length of one wall, and through it was downtown Houston in January, gray and dense and real, the buildings rising into the pewter sky, the streets 23 floors below carrying their Monday morning traffic, the whole complicated machine of the city going about its business with complete indifference to what was happening in this particular room. Eleanor had looked at that view many times. Today it looked different. She was not sure she could have said exactly why. There were 7 people at the table, 6 board members and Dominic, who sat at the near end with his general counsel. Beside him and the outside attorney, she recognized him, a partner at a litigation firm she had heard of, on his other side. The board members she knew in the way you know the consistent background figures of a life. James Alderton, who had been on the Hartwell board since before Dominic took over and who had always treated Eleanor with the courtly and slightly distracted politeness of a man who was not sure what to make of her. Helen Park, the only other woman on the board, who ran a logistics company and who Eleanor had always found sharp and somewhat underused. 4 others she knew less well, men of varying ages, who had the shared quality of people who are accustomed to being in rooms where the agenda is known in advance. The agenda had not been fully known in advance, not this morning. Patricia walked to the far end of the table. Eleanor sat to Patricia's right. She did not look at Dominic immediately. She looked at the window, at the city below, and she let the room settle around her. She let the quality of the moment be what it was. 7 years of foundation work, 8 years of marriage, 17 years of a trust structure her father built with care and precision for a day that had not existed yet when he built it, all of it converging in this room at 9 in the morning on the 3rd of January. She thought about what her father had written. "There is a place for you to stand." She was standing in it. Patricia said, "Good morning. Thank you for making time on short notice." "I know the holidays have been, Patricia." James Alderton, across the table, his voice carrying the slight impatience of someone who has been told more than once that something was routine and is beginning to suspect it isn't. "What exactly is the nature of this meeting? I've reviewed the notification your office sent, and I have to say the language was not entirely clear on the specific. The language was intentionally broad at this stage," Patricia said pleasantly. "The specifics are why we're here." She opened her briefcase. "I'll be as clear as I can be. The Vance Family Trust, through the Delaware holding company that serves as its investment vehicle, currently controls 22% of the non-dilutable voting rights in Hartwell Capital's primary fund. The trust has held this position since the fund's most recent restructuring, approximately 7 years ago, through an instrument negotiated between Charles Vance and the fund's original structure at the time of, I'm sorry. This was the outside attorney, Dominic's litigator, leaning forward slightly. Could you repeat the percentage? 22%, Patricia said. Non-dilutable, which means the pending restructuring of the fund that has been planned for the first quarter of this year cannot proceed without the consent of the trust's primary beneficiary. The silence in the room was a particular kind. Helen Park was looking at the papers Patricia had set on the table. James Alderton was looking at Dominic. Dominic was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, and Eleanor, watching him, recognized the look. It was the look he had when he was managing something internal with difficulty. Patricia's associate opened a laptop. Patricia said, "Mrs. Hartwell would like to say something before we proceed to the documentation." Eleanor had thought about this moment for 2 weeks. She had thought about it in Margaret's guest room. She had thought about it driving between Maple Brook and River Oaks. She had thought about it lying awake at 5 in the morning with the city outside the window, going gray to blue in the early light. She had composed it and revised it and stripped it back until what was left was the thing itself without decoration. She reached forward and she pressed the button on the small device Patricia had set up on the table. The screen on the wall lit up. It was a video, 12 seconds, recorded on her phone in Patricia's office on the 22nd of December, the afternoon she signed everything, standing by Patricia's window with the gray downtown light behind her. Eleanor in the charcoal suit, her mother's earrings, her face even and direct, looking at the camera the way she looked at anything she had decided to look at fully. Her voice on the recording, quiet and clear. "Dominic, my father didn't leave me money. He left me a seat at your table. It just took me 8 years to sit down in it." 12 seconds. The screen went dark. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. Eleanor watched the board members, watched the particular recalibration happening in each face, the moment of understanding passing through the room like weather. Helen Park had a look Eleanor recognized, not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just seen it happen. James Alderton was looking at Dominic with an expression that had shifted significantly from the one he'd had 2 minutes ago. Dominic's outside attorney was writing something on his notepad. Dominic was looking at Eleanor. She met his eyes. She did not look away, and she did not look through him. She looked at him directly. The way you look at someone you have shared a life with and are now in the process of understanding differently. He looked, for perhaps the first time in 8 years, like a man who was not trying to manage the room he was in. Patricia said, "The documentation before you outlines the specific structure and the legal basis for the trust's blocking rights. Section 4 addresses the restructuring plan specifically, and Section 7 covers the notification requirements that were initiated on December 26th. She paused. "We're not here to obstruct anything. We're here to establish that Mrs. Hartwell has standing, that her standing has legal weight, and that any decisions regarding the fund's restructuring will require her consent from this point forward." James Alderton said, "What does she want?" He had directed the question at Patricia, which was the kind of instinctive misdirection Eleanor had been watching happen in rooms for her entire adult life. The question about a woman in the room directed at anyone other than the woman. She answered before Patricia could. She said, "I want what is mine. I want a fair settlement on the marriage, which Patricia and Dominic's attorneys will work out. I want shared custody of our children on terms that put them first. And in exchange for my consent to the fund restructuring, I want the Vance Family Trust position in Hartwell Capital to be formally recognized and represented on this board. She paused. That's what my father built. That's what I'm asking for. Helen Park said, that seems straightforward. James Alderton cleared his throat. The outside attorney leaned to Dominic and said something quietly. Dominic shook his head, once short, the gesture of a man declining advice he has already considered and decided against. He said, I need a few days to review the documentation. Patricia said, of course, we'd ask for a response by the 10th. You'll have it, Dominic said. He looked at Eleanor one more time. His face had a quality she had not seen before, not defeat, not anger, something more complicated and considerably more honest. The face of a man in the process of understanding something that costs him something to understand. She thought about what she had said to Margaret. He's not entirely without conscience. He just misplaced it for a while. She thought he was finding it. The meeting ended 20 minutes later after Patricia walked the board through the documentation with her particular methodical precision, answering questions in the careful way of someone who knows exactly how much rope to give every question and is choosing not to give more. Eleanor sat beside her and watched and thought about nothing except what was directly in front of her. She did not look at Dominic again. She did not need to. She was almost at the elevator when she heard her name behind her. Helen Park. She was the board member Eleanor knew least well. They had spoken at Hartwell functions, the occasional dinner, the kinds of interactions that are formal enough to be polite and not much more. But Helen Park was looking at her now with an expression that was not the expression of someone making small talk at a function. She said, Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to know that I intend to support the trust's representation on this board. Eleanor looked at her. Helen said, I've been on this board for 4 years. In 4 years, I have been in rooms where the discussion went a particular way because of who was in the room and who wasn't. She paused. I'm glad you came in, Eleanor said. Thank you, Helen. They stood in the hallway for a moment. The associates from Patricia's firm were gathering their things at the end of the corridor. The sound of briefcase clasps and low voices and the particular efficient rustling of people who have done a job well and are moving on to the next one. Eleanor said, I heard your logistics firm had a strong fourth quarter. Helen said, it did. Your foundation's infrastructure grant program had something to do with that, for 2 of the vendors we use. She paused. I didn't make the connection until recently. Eleanor said, small city. Helen said, not so small. You just have to know where to look. She went back toward the conference room. Eleanor waited for the elevator. Patricia came to stand beside her. They waited in the particular silence of 2 people who have done something together that was worth doing. Patricia said, How do you feel? Eleanor looked at the elevator doors, the brushed steel, her own reflection in it, slightly warped in the way of reflective surfaces that are not quite mirrors. The charcoal suit, her mother's earrings. She said, I feel exactly like I thought I would feel. Patricia looked at her. She said, What did you think you would feel? Eleanor thought about it. She said, Ready for whatever comes next. The elevator opened. She stepped in. She rode down 23 floors watching the numbers and thinking about nothing in particular, about Liam's basketball, about whether Sophie had convinced anyone about Gerald yet, about the apartment in River Oaks with the extra room she was going to use for work, about her father's handwriting on the tab of the file folder, about the ceramic angel with the chipped wing she had left on the tree at the house on Maple Brook and needed to go back for at some point, about the board meeting that had just happened and the one that would need to happen again in a few weeks when the consent was formally negotiated, about the fact that she was 40 years old and had a seat at a table that had her father's fingerprints on it and her mother's memory in it, and her own 8 years of accumulated understanding of what she wanted and what she was willing to do to get it, about the city outside, going about its Monday business 23 floors below, indifferent and busy and alive. She thought, the next part is mine to build, whatever it looks like. The elevator reached the lobby. She walked out. Raymond at the security desk looked up. He had changed the pin on his jacket. The snowflake was gone, replaced with something small and green she couldn't quite make out. She smiled at him. He said, "Have a good one, Mrs. Hartwell." She said, "I intend to." She pushed through the glass door into the January morning. The air outside was cold and damp and smelled of exhaust and the particular mineral smell of Houston in winter. The streets were busy now, mid-morning, the city fully into its Monday. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with her coat pulled around her, and the gray sky above, and the buildings rising in every direction. And she felt the weight of the morning settling, not heavily, not unpleasantly, the way things settle when they land where they were meant to. Margaret was parked half a block down. Eleanor walked toward her. She walked at her own pace, which was not slow and was not rushed. She walked the way she had decided she was going to walk from now on, through rooms and buildings and mornings and whatever configuration of difficulty and possibility came next. She walked like a woman who knew where she was going. She got in the car. Margaret looked at her, just looked for a moment. Then she said, "Well?" Eleanor said, "The 10th. He has until the 10th to respond." Margaret said, "And you think he will?" Eleanor thought about Dominic looking at Liam's name on the permission slip. She thought about what he had said about the Christmas 7 years ago. His voice quiet and unguarded, the way of a man saying something he has known for a long time and has not said before. She said, "Yes, I think he will." Margaret pulled into traffic. The radio came on. The same classical station, something Eleanor did not immediately place, something measured and quiet, with a melody that moved forward, without rushing, phrase by phrase, each one setting up the next. She rode through the January city, thinking about what came next. There was still something that had not been resolved. Dominic's attorney had filed. That morning, Patricia had warned her, called at 7:45, while Eleanor was eating breakfast with the children, a procedural challenge to the trust blocking rights, a technical argument about the notification timeline, whether the December 26th communication met the legal requirements for the triggering event. It was not, Patricia had said, a strong argument, but it was enough to buy 2 weeks of uncertainty, enough to put one of the board members Eleanor had been counting on in an awkward position. She had not told Margaret this yet. She would. There was time. She would tell Margaret, and she would call Patricia, and she would think through what it meant and what the path around it looked like. But for right now, in the car, in the January morning, she let herself have what she had earned this morning. She had walked into that room. She had spoken. She had said what her father built and what she was asking for, and she had said it clearly and without apology. And now the thing was in motion in the way that things are when you stop waiting for the right moment and simply begin. She thought about the recording on the wall screen. 12 seconds. Her voice in the room she had never before been invited into. "My father didn't leave me money. He left me a seat at your table." She looked out the window at the January city. She thought, I am sitting in it now. Chapter 5, The Price of Taking Her Place. January in Houston does not announce itself. It arrives the way most difficult things arrive. Not dramatically, not with the kind of weather that makes for good storytelling later, just steadily. One gray morning at a time, each one slightly colder than the one before, the city pulling its coat a little tighter, without quite admitting it needs to. The magnolia in Margaret's front yard had gone the deep winter green that magnolias in the South maintain through cold months as a point of quiet pride. The eucalyptus wreath on the front door had dried completely and now rustled when you opened the door. A dry, papery sound that Sophie had become convinced was a ghost named Carl, and which Liam had spent considerable energy trying to debunk with limited success. Eleanor had moved into the apartment on the 9th. It was smaller than the house on Maplebrook by more than half, which she had known in the abstract and had not fully understood until she stood in it with the first boxes and looked at the rooms and thought, "This is the actual size of what I need." It was a good size. The kitchen had decent light in the morning, which was the thing she cared about most in a kitchen. The room she planned to use as an office looked out over a small courtyard where someone had planted a row of ornamental grasses that moved in the wind with a particular grace. The children's room they were sharing for now, which Sophie found exciting and Liam found tolerable in the way he found most things he secretly didn't mind, had a window seat that Liam had immediately claimed and which Sophie had immediately disputed ownership of, and which Eleanor had designated a shared territory governed by a rotating schedule, which satisfied nobody and was therefore probably fair. She had not heard from Dominic between the 3rd and the 10th. She had expected this. Patricia had told her to expect it, that the silence was not absence of movement, but the opposite, that the 10 days between the board meeting and the deadline were days in which multiple conversations were happening that she was not part of, that the procedural challenge his attorney had filed was being evaluated, and the documentation from Patricia's office was being worked through by people who were being paid to find something wrong with it and were finding it harder than they had expected. On the morning of the 9th, the day before the deadline, Patricia called. Eleanor was unpacking books in the apartment, the ones she had taken from the house on Maplebrook, her own books that had lived in the study's secondary shelves for 6 years, because the primary shelves were Dominic's, her books always slightly displaced in a room that was technically as much hers as his. She was on the floor with a half-empty box when her phone rang, and she sat back on her heels and answered. Patricia said, "We have a problem." Eleanor waited. "The procedural challenge," Patricia said. His attorney filed an amended version this morning. They found a gap, not in the trust structure itself, but in the notification. The December 26th communication was sent from my firm's general email system rather than through the specific channel the holding company agreement designates for formal notices. It's a small distinction. It's the kind of thing that gets corrected routinely and would never matter in a straightforward proceeding. Eleanor said, But James Alderton," Patricia said. "He called me an hour ago. He's concerned that if Dominic's challenge has any merit, the board is in an awkward position if they've already engaged with the substance of the meeting. He's not opposing you, he's protecting himself, which is what he always does. But he told me he won't vote on the formal recognition of the trust's position until the notification question is resolved." Eleanor looked at the box of books in front of her, halfway unpacked, spines facing up, an unresolved state. "Without Alderton," she said, "without Alderton, we're one vote short of the simple majority we need to get the formal recognition through at the next board meeting, which is the 15th. A pause. "The restructuring plan is still on hold. The blocking right itself is not in question, but formal recognition of your seat is a separate vote, and without Alderton, we don't have it on the 15th. Eleanor said, "What are the options?" Patricia outlined them. Option 1, wait for the notification question to be formally resolved, which would take 4 to 6 weeks and delay everything. Option 2, contest the procedural challenge aggressively, which was possible but would cost time and money, and would turn what had been a clean proceeding into something messier and more adversarial. Option 3, which Patricia mentioned last and which she said carefully. You cast the blocking vote yourself. Directly. Not through the trust's standard mechanism, not through Robert Fitch's firm as the managing vehicle, you as the primary beneficiary, invoking your direct right under Section 9 of the trust agreement. You've never used it. It's not the standard channel, but it's entirely valid, Eleanor said. What does it cost? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it requires you to take a public position before the notification question is resolved. Right now, you have the advantage of the technical high ground. Your documentation is cleaner than his. Your structure is more sound. If you invoke Section 9, you're acting before that's formally confirmed, and his attorney will argue you did so to preempt their challenge, rather than because you have the right to. But I do have the right to. You absolutely have the right to. The argument is tactical, not legal, but it will be made. Another pause. It also requires you to terminate the current relationship with one of the trust's co-managers. A formality, the co-manager in question has already agreed to step aside, but it's a step that can't be undone and that changes the trust's internal structure going forward. Eleanor said, which co-manager? Patricia said a name Eleanor recognized, a man her father had brought into the trust's management in its first years, a man she had met twice, a man she had no particular relationship with, but who had been part of the structure her father built and whose removal felt, in a way she did not try to rationalize away, like a small dismantling of something her father had arranged. She sat with that for a moment. She said, give me an hour. She finished unpacking the books. She put them on the shelves she had set up along the office wall. Her books, her order, the particular arrangement of someone who reads the way she reads, which is across subjects and without apology for the juxtapositions. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the ornamental grasses in the courtyard, moving in the January wind. She called Robert Fitch. He answered immediately, the way he always did, the deep, unhurried voice that was exactly the same at 9 in the morning on a Thursday in January as it had been every other time she had called him. She explained the situation. He was quiet while she spoke, the particular quiet of someone listening fully and not preparing his response until she was finished. When she stopped, he said, your father included Section 9 in the trust specifically because he anticipated a situation in which the standard mechanism might be slow or compromised. He told me that when we drafted it, he said, I remember this clearly because it was the kind of thing your father said that you didn't forget. He said, there are moments when waiting is the wrong choice, and I want Eleanor to be able to move when she decides to move. Eleanor said, he said that specifically. He did, Robert said. Eleanor, this is exactly what Section 9 is for. She said, it costs something. Most right decisions do, Robert said. That's generally how you know they're right. She thought about her father at his desk, the particular patience of him, the patience that was never passivity, never resignation, the patience of a man who understood the difference between waiting and hesitating, and who had built into the trust, like a set of instructions for a daughter he trusted to read them correctly, the capacity to stop waiting when the moment came. She called Patricia back. She said, Section 9. Patricia said, all right, a brief pause. I'll need your signature on the invocation documents by noon. I'll be there at 11, Eleanor said. She was. She signed the documents in Patricia's office, with the downtown Houston skyline outside the window, gray and bright in the January morning, the way it had been on the 22nd of December when she had signed the first set, the continuity of those two signings feeling, to Eleanor, like the two ends of something that was now complete. Patricia walked her through each page the way she always did, precisely and without rushing, and Eleanor read each one before she signed it, the way her father had always told her to read, Before signing anything, regardless of how well you trusted the person handing you the pen, the co-manager was formally notified by Patricia's office at 12:30. The invocation of Section 9 was filed with the board at 1. Dominic's attorney filed an objection at 2:15, which was faster than Patricia had expected and which told Eleanor something about how closely they had been watching for exactly this move. Patricia responded at 3 in language that Eleanor read that evening and which she found, even in its legal terseness, satisfying in the way of watching someone very good at their job be very good at their job. By 4 o'clock, Eleanor was back at the apartment, making dinner for the children who were spending the night before the start of the new school semester, and who had filled the apartment with the particular cheerful chaos of children who are in the process of deciding whether a new place is going to be home or not, and are leaning cautiously toward yes. Sophie had introduced Gerald to every surface in the apartment as though conducting an official inspection. Liam had colonized the window seat and was reading, but differently than usual. Every few pages, he would look up and look around the room in a way that Eleanor recognized as him taking inventory, filing things away, learning the new geography. She made the pasta they asked for, because it was Sunday, and pasta on Sunday was one of those things she had kept going, one of the continuities she was deliberate about, because continuity in the small things makes the large disruptions navigable. She thought about the documents she had signed that morning. She thought about what it had cost, the co-manager, the clean high ground, the 4 to 6 weeks. She was not going to wait. She held the cost honestly, the way she tried to hold most things, without pretending it wasn't real. Then she thought about what her father had said. There are moments when waiting is the wrong choice. She drained the pasta and made the sauce Sophie liked, the simple one with the butter and the parmesan and the black pepper, and she called the children to the table, and they ate together in the apartment that was becoming home, and outside the window, the courtyard grasses moved in the evening wind, and it was enough. Cassandra Vale called on a Thursday evening in the second week of January. Eleanor was in the car, driving back from the grocery store, the children at home with Margaret, who had come over to help with bath time, and when the number came up she recognized it. She had saved it after the first call, the way she saved information she might need later, and she pulled into a parking lot off Westheimer and answered. "I'm listening," Eleanor said. "I want to be honest with you," Cassandra said. "All right," Eleanor said. "The restructuring," Cassandra said. "My involvement in it, I told myself it was separate from Dominic personally, that I was advising him as a professional, and the personal part was something else. I told myself that for a long time." A pause. "That's not true. I knew what the restructuring would mean for his assets in a divorce. I knew before any of the personal situation was in place. I told myself it was information I happened to have, not information I was using." Eleanor sat in the parking lot. Outside, a family was loading groceries into an SUV 2 rows over, 2 small children handing items up to their father. The whole operation conducted with the cheerful inefficiency of a task that doesn't strictly need 4 people, but is happening with 4 people, because that's who showed up. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" Cassandra said, "Because Dominic's attorney wants me to file a statement supporting the procedural challenge, and I'm not going to do it." Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. She said, "That's a significant decision." "I know what I did," Cassandra said. Her voice had shifted from the first call. The control was still there, but the calculation underneath it was different, was pointed at something other than the conversation Eleanor was in. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you because I think you should know." Eleanor said, "Are you telling Dominic?" A pause. "I'm meeting with him tomorrow." Then I think you should tell him, Eleanor said, not because of the legal proceedings, because it's the honest thing to do. The silence on the line was a different quality than the silence of the first call. Not strategic, more like someone standing in a room they have not been in before, getting their bearings. Cassandra said, "Do you hate me?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. She said, "No, I'm not interested in hating you. It takes more energy than I have right now, and it doesn't produce anything I need." Another pause. "That's a very practical," Eleanor said. "Yes, I know," she paused. "Cassandra, whatever you do with the statement, the legal situation is what it is. It'll resolve either way. What I'd tell you is to do the thing you can live with, not the thing that's easiest, the thing you can actually live with." She ended the call. She sat in the parking lot for a moment. She thought about what it meant that Cassandra Vale had called her at 7 in the evening on a Thursday to say that she had not been honest and was not going to compound it. She thought about whether to tell Patricia, decided yes, sent a brief message from the parking lot before she started the car. She thought about what she had said. Do the thing you can live with. She was trying to do that herself. It was not always clear what it looked like. The thing you could live with. It did not always look like the easy thing or the winning thing or the thing that caused the least disruption. Sometimes it looked like signing a document in a lawyer's office and losing something your father had built in the process. Sometimes it looked like driving home from the grocery store in January and telling your children when they asked that everything is going to be okay and meaning it not as reassurance but as fact. She started the car. She drove home. The board meeting on the 15th passed without the drama Eleanor had half expected and without the obstruction she had half feared. Alderton, in the end, voted yes. Patricia told her afterward that she suspected Helen Park had spoken with him, though neither Helen nor Alderton confirmed this, and Eleanor did not ask. She thought about asking, and then thought, some things you accept as gifts without requiring an explanation of how they were arranged. The formal recognition of the Vance Trust's position on the Hartwell Capital Board passed with 5 votes to 2, the 2 dissenting being board members, whose opposition was principled in the way that opposition is principled when it is also convenient. Eleanor was not in the room for that vote. She had not needed to be. Patricia was there, and Robert Fitch had called in for the portion relevant to the trust. And when Patricia called Eleanor afterward with the result, Eleanor was in the apartment office, working on the foundation's first grant cycle of the new year, which was full and demanding and deeply satisfying in the way of work that matters. And she received the news the way she received it, with the particular steady quality of someone to whom the outcome was expected, was worked for, and was therefore not surprising, though it was still worth a moment of something that was very close to gratitude. She thought about her father. She said, into the empty office, "Okay, Dad, I see it now." She went back to work. Dominic came to Margaret's house. Eleanor had not yet updated the forwarding address in Dominic's phone, and Margaret's address was the one he had. On a Tuesday evening in the second week of January, after a phone call with Eleanor in which he had asked, with less of the management she was used to and more of the person underneath it, if he could see the children. She had said yes. She had also said, "Come to Margaret's at 6. The children will have had dinner. I'll be there." She was not sure why she said the last part. She did not need to be there. Margaret was perfectly capable of managing an hour with Dominic and the children, but something in her wanted to be there, not to supervise, not to manage, but just to be present in the room where this was happening. She thought maybe it was something about completion, about not removing herself from the last chapter of something she had lived completely. She was in the kitchen with Margaret when he arrived. Margaret answered the door. Eleanor heard the voices in the hallway, Margaret's even and pleasant, Dominic slightly careful, the particular register of a man who is not sure of his reception and is being more polite than usual to compensate. Then Sophie's voice, high and immediate, the way Sophie engaged with everything she was interested in, which was most things. Then Liam, quieter, his voice doing the thing it did when he was uncertain, dropping slightly lower than his normal register. The children took Dominic to the den. Eleanor heard the television, heard Sophie explaining something at length, heard Liam's slightly reluctant participation in whatever Sophie had organized, heard Dominic's laugh, short, genuine, the laugh that came out of him when he forgot to manage himself for a moment. She and Margaret stayed in the kitchen. Margaret made tea. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor had told Margaret about the trust, the same table where so much of the last 3 weeks had been processed and considered and talked through in the way of sisters who have known each other long enough to have developed a shared language for the difficult things. Margaret said, "You don't have to go in." "I know," Eleanor said, "but you're going to." "Eventually," Eleanor said. "I want to let them have it first." They sat with their tea, and the sounds of the children and Dominic in the other room came through the wall, and Eleanor thought about what she wanted to say to him and whether she needed to say anything at all, and she decided that she would know when she got there, which was how she felt about most of the things that mattered. After about 45 minutes, she heard the children's voices shift, the particular shift of children heading toward bedtime, Sophie's protests, Liam's slightly superior acceptance of the inevitable. She heard Margaret go in and do the negotiation that resulted 15 minutes later in both children being in the bunk room down the hall, Sophie still arguing her case about Carl the ghost wreath, and Liam already quiet in the way of a boy who is reading or almost asleep. She gave it another few minutes. Then she went to the den. Dominic was sitting on the sofa. He had taken off his jacket. It was draped over the arm, which was a thing he did when he was settling in somewhere. The unconscious signal of a man making himself comfortable, and he was looking at the far wall where the children had left evidence of themselves, the usual accumulation. Sophie's drawings tacked up by Margaret with the indulgent permanence of an aunt who would leave them there for months. Liam's basketball propped in the corner, the particular disorder of a space that is being lived in with genuine enthusiasm. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Sophie told me there's a ghost in the wreath." "Carl," Eleanor said. "It's been a whole thing." He almost smiled. She sat down on the armchair across from him, not the sofa, the armchair, the distance between them, the honest distance of where they were. He said, "Liam looked good." "He is good," she said. "He's been processing things in that quiet way he does. I check in with him every few days. His school counselor has been helpful." Dominic nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "I should have done that more, the checking in." She did not tell him he was right, or tell him it was okay. She let him have the truth of it without either confirmation or comfort, because that was what honesty required. She said, "How are you doing?" He looked slightly surprised by the question. She thought that said something about the last several years, that the straightforward question of how he was doing surprised him when she asked it. He said, "Honestly, please." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about what I built and what I let fall apart at the same time. I think those were happening simultaneously for a long time, and I didn't register it. I was building the firm, and I was letting everything else get smaller, and I told myself that was a trade-off that made sense." He stopped. "It didn't make sense. I just told myself it did." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "When did you understand that?" He said, "When I read the papers you gave me on Christmas Eve. Not because of the legal, not right away because of the legal content. It was reading your name. Patricia Dunn's name, your name, and the date. You signed them on the 23rd. You made that decision on the 23rd and came home and made dinner and let me walk through that door thinking I knew what was happening." He paused. "I understood then that you had been thinking for a long time about things I hadn't been thinking about, that you were further along in understanding what was true than I was. And it wasn't about being outsmarted. It was about our realizing you had been paying attention for years, and I hadn't been paying attention to you paying attention." He stopped again. "That sounds complicated." "It doesn't," Eleanor said. He looked at her. She said, "You thought being capable was enough for me too. You thought because I managed everything, I didn't need anything. Same thing I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, "I'm sorry, Eleanor." She sat with that. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about whether she would feel something release when it came, whether there was something in her waiting for it, the way people wait for apologies in the belief that the apology is the thing that allows them to stop carrying what they have been carrying. She found that she had already set most of it down, that she had been setting it down piece by piece since the afternoon in the parking structure with the Clementines, since the phone call to Patricia, since the night she handed him the envelope, since the board meeting, since the apartment office with the ornamental grasses outside the window. The carrying had been gradual, and so had the setting down. And by the time he said the words, she found that what she felt was not release so much as completion, the last piece of something being placed. She said, "I know." She meant it as what it was, not absolution, not forgiveness in the way that word gets misused to mean forgetting, but acknowledgement. She heard him, and she knew he meant it, and that was what the moment required. She said, "The custody arrangement. Patricia and your attorney are almost done with the language. I want you to read it carefully, not just have your attorney summarize it. I want you to know exactly what it says." "I will," he said. "The children need consistency from both of us. More than they need anything else, they need to know that we're not going to make them navigate between us. They're not messengers. They're not our representatives to each other. Whatever we need to say, we say it to each other." "Agreed," he said. "And Dominic," she paused, "the foundation. The Vance Foundation. I'm going to be spending more time on it. It's going to be a larger part of what I do. I want you to understand that when it comes up, when the children mention it, that it matters to me, that it's not a hobby. It's work." He says, "I know that. I've known that." A pause. "I didn't treat it that way. I should have." She nodded. She stood up. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the arm of the sofa. She walked him to the door. He stopped in the hallway. He looked, for a moment, like he might say something else. She watched him consider it and then decide against it, and she thought the decision was probably the right one, that the thing he had been about to say was something that belonged to a different kind of conversation, one that was not going to happen. He said, "Thank you for letting me come tonight," she said. "They're your children too. That doesn't change." He put on his coat. He went to the door and opened it, and the cold January air came in, and the dry, papery sound of the eucalyptus wreath rustled in the draft. He paused. He said, "Eleanor, that trust, what your father built, he was right about you." She looked at him. He said, "Whatever he thought you were capable of, he was right." She did not say anything. She let the words be in the room between them without adding to them or deflecting them, because that was what they deserved, to be received simply without qualification. He left. She closed the door. She stood in Margaret's hallway for a moment, with the cold of outside fading and the warmth of the house settling back in around her, and she thought about her father and what he had written. "You are braver than you know." She thought about the 8 years before, and the morning of December 23rd, when she had signed the papers and the parking structure and the Clementines and the tree with 43 ornaments, and the gingerbread still warm in the kitchen, and the drive through the quiet streets with the children sleeping in the back and the radio on. She thought about all of it together, the whole shape of it, and she thought, I know what this was now. I know what it cost and what it built and what it was worth. She thought it was worth quite a lot. She went down the hall and looked in on the children. Sophie was asleep with Gerald under one arm, and the kind of total completeness of sleep that belongs only to children, and the very untroubled. Liam was on the bottom bunk, not quite asleep, his book face down on his chest, looking at the ceiling with the particular thoughtful stillness of a boy who is thinking something through. She sat on the edge of the bunk. He said, "Was that Dad?" "Yes," she said. "Is he okay?" She thought about Dominic's face in the den, the apology, the jacket over the arm of the sofa, the way he had looked at the children's drawings on Margaret's wall. "He's going to be okay," she said. "It's going to take a little time, but he's going to be okay." Liam was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you okay?" She smiled. He asked her this with some regularity. This child of hers, with the serious attentiveness of someone who has appointed himself to the position of monitoring whether the things that matter are actually all right. She said, "I'm okay. I'm genuinely okay. I promise." He looked at her in that careful way of his. Then he nodded. He picked up his book. She sat with him for a while longer, until his breathing slowed and the book slid to one side. And she took it and set it on the small shelf Margaret had installed at the end of the bunk, and she tucked the blanket around him and sat in the quiet of the room for a minute. Sophie turned over in her sleep and made a small sound and settled. Eleanor looked at her children sleeping. She thought, this is still the center of it, this specifically. Whatever else gets sorted or settled or built from here, this is what it was always for. She went to bed. The final paperwork was signed on a Tuesday morning in early February. Patricia's office on a Tuesday morning looked exactly the same as it had on December 22nd. Same furniture, same light coming through the same windows, same view of downtown Houston, with its buildings and its gray winter sky, and its particular version of itself in the cold morning. Eleanor sat at the same chair. The settlement agreement was 47 pages. She had read all of it. She had read it 3 times, in fact, once with Patricia walking her through it, once alone at the apartment kitchen table with coffee, and once more the night before, just to be certain she was signing what she understood herself to be signing, and nothing additional. It was, Patricia had said, a good settlement. Fair in the way that settlements can be fair when both parties have good counsel and a shared interest in not prolonging things unnecessarily. The custody arrangement was what Eleanor had asked for. The financial division was what the structure allowed for and what she had agreed to. The trust's position on the Hartwell Capital Board was formalized and protected. There were 47 pages of things that had been worked out, and each page represented something that had been in dispute and was now resolved, and the resolution of them added up, altogether, to the documented end of 8 years of marriage and the beginning of what came next. She signed each page. Patricia witnessed. At the last page, the signature line on the final document, the one with the words, "Final Settlement Agreement" across the top, in the particular unadorned capitals of legal headings. Eleanor held the pen for a moment. She looked at the window. The Texas sky outside Patricia's window was doing the thing it sometimes did on winter mornings in Houston, a blue so clear and deep it was almost aggressive about it, the sun bright and cold and streaming through the glass in a way that made the room warmer looking than it was, the buildings of downtown lit up against it in a way that was close to beautiful. No snow, there was never snow, just the sky and the light and the city going about its business. She thought about Christmas Eve, the gingerbread still warm, the tree with 43 ornaments, The ceramic angel with the chipped wings she had gone back for last week, which was now on the small bookshelf in the apartment office. Slightly crooked the way she had always been, the chip on her wing as familiar as anything Eleanor owned. She thought about the drive through the quiet streets with the children sleeping, the radio on the classical station, Sophie's small sound in the back seat, and Liam trying to stay awake so he could understand what was happening. She thought about the file folder in her bag and her father's handwriting on the tab and the letter on the cream paper with the navy monogram. There is a place for you to stand. She thought about the boardroom and 12 seconds on a screen and the sentence she had spent 2 weeks composing down to its bones. She thought about Liam asking her if she was okay. Are you okay? Every few days, with the serious attentiveness of someone who has made it his business to know. She thought, I am going to tell him someday, when he is old enough to understand the whole of it, what these weeks were. I am going to tell him the way my father told me things, not to burden him with it but to give him something solid to carry forward. I am going to tell him that his grandmother's family built something careful and lasting, and that his mother used it when she needed it, and that the using of it was not weakness, but exactly the opposite. I am going to tell him you can love someone and still need to leave, that leaving is sometimes the bravest form of love, the one that keeps everything from becoming something you can't recover from. I am going to tell him that his grandfather, whom he is old enough to miss but not old enough to have known fully, was the kind of man who thought about everything in advance and loved in the particular way of people who express love as protection, and that is a real and valid kind of love. And it was enough. She set the pen to the paper. She signed her name, Eleanor Vance Hartwell, all 4 syllables of it. She did not abbreviate. She did not rush. She wrote it the way she had always written it, clearly, with her full name, taking up exactly the space it needed and not one letter more. She set the pen down. Patricia said, "That's everything." Eleanor looked at the stack of signed pages on the table in front of her, 47 of them. Everything that had needed to be said, said. Everything that had needed to be settled, settled. She looked at the window one more time. The sky outside was that impossible February blue. The sun was doing that thing it did in winter, low and bright and not quite warm enough but trying. Houston below was its Monday self, its ordinary self, the self it was on every Tuesday morning when nothing particular was happening except the ordinary complicated business of people living their lives. She thought, I have been here before, in this chair, looking at this window, and I was different then than I am now, and what is between those 2 versions of me is something I would not undo. She thought, whatever comes next, I am starting it as myself. She stood up. She put on her coat. She said to Patricia, "Thank you. For all of it. For every piece of it." Patricia said, "It was the right case to take." A pause. "Your father would have liked watching this," Eleanor said. "He would have been completely insufferable about it." Patricia smiled. "Probably." Eleanor picked up her bag. She walked to the door of Patricia's office. She walked down the hallway past the receptionist who had been there every time she came in, and who by now greeted her with the particular warmth of someone who has watched a story reach its conclusion and found the ending satisfying. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She rode down. She walked through the lobby and through the glass door and out into the February morning, and the air hit her the way cold air hits you when you come out of a warm building, sudden and real and clarifying, the kind of air that reminds you that you have a body, and the body is here, present, in this particular moment, on this particular morning, alive and unhurt and moving forward. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She looked at the sky. She thought about nothing. Then she thought about Sophie's dentist appointment next Thursday and Liam's basketball practice on Saturday. and the foundation grant review on Wednesday that she had been looking forward to for 3 weeks, and the ornamental grasses outside the apartment office window that moved in the morning wind with that particular grace she had come to appreciate, and the guest room quilt at Margaret's that she kept meaning to return, but kept not returning, because Margaret kept saying, "Leave it, keep it, it looks right on your bed." She thought about the ceramic angel with the chipped wing on the bookshelf, slightly crooked, the chip on her wing as familiar as anything in the world. She thought, "I will go home now." She walked to her car. She drove through the February city in the cold, bright morning, the radio on the classical station, the sky above Houston doing its best impression of something infinite and clear, the streets opening up ahead of her, one after another, each one leading somewhere, each somewhere leading somewhere else. She drove home, the end.